Now we're in the heart of some very cool things and some very creepy things about Salem. We'll start with the cool stuff. Just down the end of the block there, behind where those traffic lights are, right now it's a big condo complex, but about 30 years ago, that's where the Parker Brothers factory still stood. And the Parkers actually took care of Salem in a very unique way. Say you lost the pieces to one of your games. We'll use Monopoly as an example, because there's a lot of Monopoly that's going to come up. You lost the little pieces to go around the board. All it was said that you had to do, go to the office, speak to the receptionist, tell her what you needed. She would take it from a cupboard behind the counter and give it to you free of charge. Try getting the company nowadays to do that. But now most of you guys have probably played Monopoly, right? Yes? Now we all know about the jail spot. Go directly to jail. The catch is, in the original game when it was first built before the Parkers bought it, that spot didn't exist. That building there is the old Salem jail building. And when the Parkers bought the Monopoly game and produced it themselves, one of the first things they did was add the jail spot inspired by this building. In fact, if you look at one of the cards, I'm not sure if it's the get out of jail or the go to jail card, but you will see a shape identical to that tower on the right.
Huh.
Looks like a kind of a lampshade with a lattice on the top, but that's on the card. At least the ones that I remember. Now here's another one that kind of, people will usually pick up on this, usually better in daylight hours. But you see the little row houses in the back there? Yeah, I can hear it already. Monopoly houses. Those houses are visible from where the factory used to be. It's not too hard a stretch to figure out that that's might be where they got the inspiration for it. Now we go for the creepy stuff. We're in the heart of some of the darkest events of the witch trials. Maybe a little too close to the heart, if you get my meaning. This road here used to be called Prison Lane. And where this big office building, which started out light in the 50s as the phone company used to stand, or stands now, used to stand Salem's dungeon. Built in 1684. By the time of the trials, it still has that new dungeon smell. Whatever that is. Very dark, cruel, and dismal place. And witches had some of the worst conditions of all. Aside from the fact that simply being charged as a witch opened you up to all sorts of abuses by the guards. But they locked witches in what they called a coffin cell. This was because, according to the legends of the day, a witch could send its spirit out to torment the living. This was the basis for that spectral evidence business that the girls were using to convict innocent people of being witches. So they put them in these narrow, cubicle, basically coffin-sized spaces, and for good measure, gave them about 100 pounds of heavy iron chains and shackles to keep them company. When the foundations of this building were first started in the 1950s, they came up with timbers that still had chains and shackles attached. How is this possible? Built in 1684, abandoned in 1813, the dungeon was never leveled until 1957, when the foundations were started. The place was basically left there to rot. It was so despised and hated. And when it was gone, no one was sad to see it go. Now back past here is Howard Street Cemetery. All cemeteries are off limits after dark. Howard Street, we're not even allowed to take tours in during the daylight hours. This is not because we did anything wrong. The tours were actually basically by city ordinance kicked out of here. The reason being is the area gets a lot of attention, especially in October. And this is because this is the area where in 1692 Giles Corey meets his unfortunate demise, pressed to death under heavy stones. The Iron Man, they call him, for surviving 3 days of torture, the man who would not plead, although that one's a little bit inaccurate. The man who cries out the historically fateful words, "More weight." We know a bit about Giles. Tall, older man, long graying hair and beard, broad-brimmed hat and cloak. Very powerful, physically powerful man into his 80s. But because of his appearance, his neighbors will sometimes call him the Old Wizard. Just what you want to be called with the witch trials on the horizon. Also involved in some kind of sketchy situations. The most noticeable of which is the death of his second wife, Mary Corey. She was said to die of a tumble down 2 flights of stairs in the Corey household. And that kind of fate almost writes itself in those days, because you're talking women who wore skirts to their ankles, narrow staircases, there were no electric lights. For good measure, our good friend Mary was a bit of a drunk and much older. Why were they suspicious? Well, apparently somebody told the courts that the 2 sets of stairs were at opposite ends of the house. All right, Mary had a running start. Giles must have pulled something like that. The times being what they were, he was never held accountable. However, wife number 3 will make up for it, because inadvertently, Martha Corey will get Giles killed. She's one of the unfortunates that was targeted. And all of her neighbors agreed that she was the wrong person. A good, kind, caring woman, generous to a fault, church-going, religious, pious, known as a gospel woman, said to drive the old man crazy with her incessant preaching. Why was she targeted? All of the above. She really was all of those things. And because of it, she was vocally opposed to the trials. A little too vocally, because word got back to the girls across the river. And they have an answer for things like that. When you don't believe in them, what do? Witch! Poor Martha was arrested and charged with witchcraft. Giles was arrested as an afterthought. He was grabbed at one of her examinations. And ever the gentleman was said to have said, "Nay, nay, truly, 'tis not I that you want. 'Tis Martha, my wife." Yes, the 1692 version of "Take my wife, please." But Giles Corey had actually been suspicious. He had a really gut feeling that they were going to come for him. And this is when they arrest him. This is where it gets interesting, because he pulls probably one of the best fast ones in history. Now, he does plead not guilty at his arraignment, but what he does next is what ends him up in trouble. Because what he does essentially is refuse the Puritan court's authority to try him. He's actually within his rights to do this. It just doesn't sit well with them. And he's done it for a very real reason. By doing so, by refusing their authority, there can be no trial. And they will, strangely enough, abide by this. Without the trial, there can be no hanging. Because as we all know from history, once the trial starts, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion they were going to hang you anyways. Without the hanging, they can't take everything he owns. This is what he has been paying attention to. That little clause that says if you get hanged, the colony gets, or the crown, I should say, gets to seize all your stuff. Anybody want to guess how much the crown really got? Just off the top of anybody's head? Bueller?
Nothing.
Very good, thank you. Nothing.
From him, right?
Well, from anybody.
Oh, okay.
Oh, the property and money's been being seized, but where's it going? Into the greedy sharp pockets of the sheriff of Salem, George Corwin. And he's being aided and enabled by 4 different relatives on the witch trial court. 2 of whom, his uncle Jonathan and John Hathorne, were the ones who found that little bit about the crown getting to seize everything you owned. Also, it might interest you to know that Giles was one of the largest landowners in the area as well. So how do we get Giles to accept the sheriff's authority to try them? We bring the sheriff into play. High Sheriff George Corwin, who, for the young age of 24, is a detestably corrupt, sadistic, and evil young man. He owes his position to his uncle, Jonathan Corwin, the man who owned the place they call the Witch House. He was one of the magistrates. Very tall and handsome, physically powerful, long flowing cloak, called the Strangler by some of his neighbors. Apparently he caught some young boy fleeing the scene of some mischief, grabs this poor kid by the throat, and says, did you do this? Are you responsible? I'm sorry, you're standing in the right place. You're not a young kid. The boy froze in terror, so the sheriff literally, cloak and all, Darth Vader's this poor kid up into the air and holds him there kicking and crying till the kid confesses, nearly strangled to death and crying tears of blood. It's much more fun with little children because they had a tendency to scatter. And then there's the poor girl who had the hiccups. Really body-shaking case of hiccups. Not when I got done with it. For the record, ladies and gentlemen, I love my job. Now, in all fairness to the sheriff, not that he deserves it, he gave Giles several opportunities to avoid what was coming. The old man remained silent, so for that, he will endure 3 days of horrifying torture. He's dragged to the field, staked out on the ground in his chains and rags. A door is laid atop of his body from the jail, and from a pile of heavy stones they've prepared, they inflict upon him a French torture that was outlawed in the colonies. They will begin to pile these stones atop the door. With each stone, they will ask the question, Giles Corey, will you accept the court's authority in the charge of witchcraft against thee? For 3 days, this poor man will endure this. Now, at one point during the torture, one of the sheriff's men interrupts him. Goodman, Sheriff, the accused cannot answer. You've pressed his tongue out of his mouth. The old man is lying to one side, his head cocked, barely breathing, his tongue hanging out. Sheriff stops his men, takes his staff, walks to stand over Giles, and proceeds to force his tongue back into his head with the butt of his staff, before ordering them to continue. Oh, this is a lovely soul, as you'll find out next. Now at noon, he quiets the great crowd that is gathered. Once again, he will ask that question, Giles Corey, will you accept the court's authority in the charge of witchcraft against thee? But from this interrogation comes 2 answers. One of them is the answer that we all hear from history, the fateful words, more weight. The old man's way of saying, get it over with, you're not getting my stuff. But the sheriff, in some accounts, climbs up on top of the pile and sits down facing the old man, granting him his wish. But a number of people hear him cry out the words, I curse thee, Sheriff Corwin, and I curse the city of Salem, that they both be cursed in blood. It matters not which answer is correct at this point. He's under nearly 1,000 pounds of weight and will be crushed in that field. 3 days later, September 22nd, 1692, the last 8 unfortunates are carted from that black dungeon to Gallows Hill to be hanged. Amongst them goes Martha Corey with a small amount of satisfaction. The old man went first. Thus ends the story of Giles and Martha Corey. Now, for the record, Giles did not suffer in vain. In fact, as I said, he pulled a fast one. And it wasn't just the refusing the court's authority. He suspected they were going to come for him all along. So prior to them arresting him from charging him with witchcraft, he sent somebody to the magistrate in Boston, deeded all of his money and property to his stepsons from marriage with Martha. There was nothing to seize. When time came, he was penniless. So what did the sheriff actually get out of the whole thing in the end?
Nothing.
Dead. Cursed, that was a very good word. Cursed is correct. Dead. Before his 29th birthday. They say choking on his own blood. Now that Salem jail building opened up in 1812, at which point the dungeon was abandoned, will serve the state of Massachusetts till the mid-1990s, till it is closed due to inhumane living conditions. In all that time, there were never toilets in the cell blocks. They gave you a bucket.
Ooh.
And then towards the end, they were packing 6 to a cell, no air conditioning, fight's gonna break out, the guards are called in. What do they throw at the guards? Ew is right. After it closed, 3 different times, developers tried to redevelop that building. 3 different times they failed, almost as if it was cursed. Ghost hunters from around the world come here. There have been a number of suicides here, including a person involved with a famous murder that you'll hear about later. And Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler himself, was once held in this building. There was always question about his guilt or innocence, even amongst the families of his victims. A new DNA test 2 years ago, apparently with new technology, closed the books. They connected him with each and every one. 2012, the 200-year anniversary of this building, it finally reopens to its newest configuration. What did we do with it? Luxury apartments and a restaurant. Oh, yes, we did. And they lock you in, pun intended, to a 3-year lease. But it is said, well, at least they got toilets now.
Well, I was going to say, do they at least have toilets?
Yes, they have toilets. But it is said, so long as the office of sheriff existed in Salem, any there we go. Any sheriff of Salem who was warden of that jail will leave office tragically young, usually in a pine box, dead from massive heart failure, or they say strange illnesses of the blood. And supposedly one of Salem's greatest disasters comes out of that very cemetery. The last week of June 1914, people were claiming to see a ghostly figure stalking amongst the headstones. Of course, the first presumption is Giles. So many people called the police, that they posted guards around the cemetery to keep the curious at bay. On June 25th, sometime afternoon, they recalled the guards on probably the hottest day of the year. But shortly thereafter, a fire will break out in the chemical room of a works down on the North River, a leather works. It's a small fire when it starts, but by the end of the next day, it consumes 275 acres of Salem, 1,600 buildings, 17,000 people homeless or out of work. The Great Fire of 1914. The question is, if that was Giles's ghost they saw in the cemetery, was he cursing us? Or as some have actually postulated, was the old man trying to warn us of the disaster to come? Who can say? So we're going to head up the way towards another very famous place, not only from the witch trials, but from one of the most famous inventions in all American history. Was in fact Bridget Bishop's Tavern. She is the first unfortunate hanging in 1692. She is not the first arrested. Curiously enough, it's not her first run into the law for witchcraft.
No.
She'd been accused a number of years before. Apparently her husband had suffered an unfortunate fall from the tavern, and her neighbors accused her of bewitching him. But remember, folks, these good people live in a tavern. So had Bridget been communing with the spirits to cause his untimely demise, or in fact had the husband?
It's in threes. Gotta do it in threes.
Gotta do it in threes. Been communing with spirits. Oh, don't worry, this is water. The only way I get through these nights sometimes. If it was alcohol, it'd be another tour entirely. In fact, she's out of business because of that. Thank you very much. Thank the gods. Now, I'm not going to take any guesses as to what actually happened, but witch hysteria had not kicked in. 1692, however, things are a little different. Bridget is a very big target, no pun intended. She's very tall, very attractive into her mid-50s, wears a lot of brightly colored clothing, a lot of scarlet, with all the jokes that can be probably made about that. Accused sometimes of making men uncomfortable. She shows off too much skin. Those ankles are so distracting. Smokes a pipe, plays shuffleboard, drinks the cider of the day, which is alcohol. But she's also a landowner. A fairly wealthy one at that. She's probably one of the first instances where they listed off that little clause. She owns a number of apple orchards. That's what I'm stumbling on. Apple orchards. And the thing is, here's the double whammy. Not only are people trying to go after her for her wealth, the sheriff wants one of the orchards. That parking lot area that we came through just then, that's said to be where one of her orchards sat. The sheriff wanted the land because he wanted a bigger dungeon. He cannot legally take the land from her, but if she's hanged as a witch, then the Crown gets to take everything you own. Now, she's never been to the village. She doesn't know who the girls are, and supposedly they don't know her. So how'd they get her name again? Just saying. She will attempt to defend herself mightily, but on June 10th, 1692, she will tragically become one of the first people hanged. Now this building comes into existence, the old Lyceum Hall building. It is famous because in 1878, a brand new invention in America is demonstrated here by its inventor. The first long-distance telephone call by Alexander Graham Bell, done at a lecture in this very building. Bell himself, actually during that period, was living approximately 2 blocks from here, teaching, working at Boston University. When he was in Salem, living with a family named Sanders, he was tutoring their young son who had been born deaf. He's apparently so very good at doing what he is doing for the son that when it comes time to manufacture the telephone, Mr. Sanders will invest a great deal of his wealth to make sure that Bell's telephone is in fact a success. The call is a whopping 17 miles to Boston, but this is Salem. Things don't always go the way they're supposed to. Some places are blessed by history. What was our word again? Thank you. I love it when the whole group just about does that. They say there was an accident. Somebody crossed the wrong wire during the setup for the experiment. Doesn't take a lot of juice to stop a heart. Welcome to Salem, where your phone bill's a killer. Yeah, I went there. Every ghost hunter show in history just about has been upstairs in the banquet hall, which is where most of the paranormal activity in this building takes place. One of the most spectacular things was actually shown by Haunted History not Haunted History, Ghost Adventures on the Travel Channel. And what they got, and they actually showed but never explained, was a picture taken at a banquet held every year around Halloween to honor the spirits of the dead. They actually had the mother lode here. What they got was the picture that night, many years ago, was the picture of a young girl in colonial garb, literally rising to the floor in front of one of the banquet tables. She was blurry and indistinct in places, and other places the detail, like the wave in her hair, was noticeable. Everybody remarked about her face. Our company used to hold one of these, the rare copies of this photo. Mostly it was the witches that held these pictures because they held the banquet. It looked like the girl was screaming. It's not Bridget. This is a young girl. Bridget was in her 50s. There is a young victim of the trials that does not get the due she should, primarily because she lived. Her name was Dorcas Good, the daughter of witch trial accusee Sarah Good. And unfortunately, when Dorcas was charged as a witch alongside of her mother, she was only 6 years old. All the history books seem to come up with is that something was odd about little Dorcas. Now, there's a lot of things that we know about today that they didn't in 1692. She could have been autistic. She could have been developmentally challenged. She could have had emotional issues. All we know is that the girls picked up on it, charged her with witchcraft, and had her locked in the dungeon with her mother. And amongst the terrors she endures, the sight of her mother being dragged to gallows hill to be hanged. She will survive the trials against all odds, the disease, the tortures, the psychological terror. Mind you, this little girl probably didn't have all her faculties to begin with. 1693, Governor Phipps issues amnesty to the remaining victims locked up behind bars. There is unfortunately a tragic catch. In those days, if you're locked in jail at all, you have to pay the colony for your upkeep. If you can't pay the bill, they don't let you out. It took her father another 5 months to get that poor girl out of there. She is one of the last people released in May of 1693. She is also pretty much out of her mind. And I'd like to say that there's a happy ending to this, but apparently her father was not. Let's just say he tried to make his investment back on freeing his daughter. And her life basically ended in her teens when she took her own life up to her. Could that be the ghost they saw upstairs? My personal opinion is it's a very likely case. Like I said, every ghost hunter show in history has been here. Here's the catch though. The new owners run a fine restaurant, but apparently are not using the upstairs banquet hall the way they used to. And right after that photograph was taken at that banquet at that Halloween, they moved the dumb supper, which is what it was known as, to a different location. They don't hold it here anymore. Who would have thought? And so we're going to head up towards the old waterfront. Not only because of a secret beneath the streets, but also because we're going to go by where Harry Houdini did one of his escapes. Haunted History actually did an episode on this building, and they got a fun one. Now, as I said, they used to hold banquets up there, wedding receptions, parties. One night as they were setting up for the party, the ladies who had just finished doing all the linens on the tables went downstairs to fetch the china and the flatware. When they came back upstairs with the first load, they had left all the chairs lined up under the tables. When they got back, the chairs were stacked up on top of all the tables. Nobody heard or saw a thing, and they were only gone about 4 minutes. So put everything down, go downstairs, get the managers, come on back up. No, you gotta come up and see this. Well, they saw it all right, except the chairs weren't where they left them. Now the chairs were lining the 4 walls of the hall. And they do a reenactment of Bridget's arrest and trial every year in the summertime. Once upon a time, they used to hold that reenactment there on really brutally hot summer days. Imagine, if you will, the effect on that building reading the actual transcripts of Bridget's arrest and trial happened. Let's just say for the record that when they stopped holding the reenactments there, this is another one of those cases where nobody was really sad to see them go, because they were usually guaranteed about 3 days of really bizarre things happening after one of those reenactments. Now we're headed towards the old waterfront. Hollywood was filming. Robert De Niro, Bradley Cooper, Jennifer Lawrence were all in at the Hawthorne Hotel filming part of a new project. I think the movie's going to be called Joy. Other things have been filmed here. For the younger at heart, those of you who know of rock star and horror movie producer Rob Zombie, he shot the movie Lords of Salem on location here. Hey! In fact, he got the pharmacy, the bookstore, and the clock all in some of his shots. But we're actually, as we come around the corner here, we're going to look at the site of a famous Halloween classic.
Yes.
And it tells the story of three sisters named Sanderson and the mischief they caused one Halloween night. I already know several people have the answer to this. What's the movie, ladies?
Hocus Pocus.
Thank you very much. Yes, you are looking at the Halloween party location shot from the movie Hocus Pocus, where Bette Midler came to sing her little song. This is the outside shot. The inside was done on a soundstage in Hollywood. There's a couple of other locations. Further up on Essex Street, there is the Ropes Mansion, which is known as the Hocus Pocus house because that was Alice and the Girlfriend's house. They filmed on Salem Commons. And according to what I've been told, location scouts have already been here to begin plotting for a Hocus Pocus 2.
Yes.
I did hear about that.
Yeah, they're supposedly already, it hasn't been greenlit yet, but it's supposedly already in the works.
Yes.
Also, Bewitched, the TV show was filmed here. We got
Yes.
that one because of a fire in Hollywood. Destroyed all their sets. So they came out here to film on location, and we got, for the record, we got a lovely little statue out of the deal. It's one of the best tourist attractions in town now. Pity when they unveiled it, everybody hated it. Who'd have thought? Some people didn't like the fact that TV Land bought a corner of the park. Some people did not like the fact that it was not dedicated to one of the victims of the witch trials. We did eventually get a witch memorial, just not so prominently placed. And of course, there are people who did not like the fact that she was, in fact, a witch. We get them every year at October. They bring their megaphones. Then last year, they picked on the wrong street performer. The city took their megaphones away, and a curious thing happened. We all had fun. Because we outnumbered them about 100,000 to 1. And suddenly, all of those shrill voices telling us all where we're going to go couldn't be heard because of the people having fun. I like it like that. Now, funny thing is, when I went looking for that statue, with all the outcry about it the first time, I missed it 3 times. It's not a big statue. Some of you guys have probably seen it today, right? It's tiny. It's tasteful. Now, one of the other things that used to be on this site, back when this was all a harbor, the mansion belonging to the first millionaire in America, Elias Hesketh Derby, a famous Salem merchant, was on this site. Derby was said to be so good at what he did that he could look across the harbor at a ship at anchor and tell you how good she was just by the way she rowed. Now, here's the catch. Elias Derby's great-grandson, Elias III, was the man in charge of transforming the old militia muster field, which was a swamp, into Salem Commons. Thing is, it was also Elias III and his friends that were tunneling merrily under the streets of Salem. You know, nobody ever really asked where the dirt came from to fill in the commons. Had to go somewhere. So we're going to head down to the Harry Houdini site right now, guys. In 1906 was the Front Street Jail and Courthouse. That year, Salem was being graced by a visit from the famous delusionist and escape artist Harry Houdini. He was already performing here, but he also had a standing challenge wherever he went. Lock me in one of your jail cells, I can get out in under 30 minutes. Kind of like the old Domino's pledge. 30 minutes or less, your next escape is free. Now, in this case, if he succeeds, they pay him $2,500. If he fails, I guess he's supposed to pay the city, but we know from history pretty much that, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 examples, Houdini usually really doesn't fail. So they take him up on the challenge. He's brought to the jail. Up to the cell blocks he goes. They strip him down to his socks and underwear, lock him in 3 sets of handcuffs, 2 sets of leg irons, lock him into a cell. Sheriff comes outside, takes out his pocket watch, begins to time the event. Once again, just checking. The ghosts have a tendency to do a number on them. 13 minutes in, the door pops open. Out comes Harry Houdini, twirling a set of handcuffs. Still in his skivvies, they say. He bows to the crowd. Ta-da! To steal a line from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. There was much rejoicing.
Yay!
Thank you. I like that because the last 3 tours I've done, people have done that, and it makes me feel very good. Houdini said he could have got out faster, but he said he took pity on Salem. He actually felt a connection with our beautiful city, almost a spiritual connection. This is not the usual thing you hear from Houdini. He does not like spiritualists, psychics, or mediums. More correctly, the frauds who pretend to be such. He had been taken advantage of that way in his youth, and in his adult life, he is debunking the frauds. So good is he that when he goes into a new city, they tend to go into hiding, because they know one of his favorite things is to show up in disguise and muck with the works. But for that, every year at Halloween, another city in America holds a seance to connect with the spirit of Harry Houdini because he did in fact say he would come back. It was Salem's turn in 1992 during the big Halloween ball held at the Hawthorne Hotel. Too much fanfare and apparently little result. It seems Harry never got the memo. But while he was out here with the crowd, they were greeted with a strange event. The door opened behind them, and there's another man standing there in his socks and underwear. He smiles at the crowd gathered, bows briefly, turns to his right, and runs off up the sidewalk like a madman. By the way, when he was locked in that cell, it wasn't empty. There was a prisoner in there. Uh-huh. Try that nowadays. Oh, he didn't get very far before he was tackled. But that is why that jail on the other side of town used to have a restaurant called The Great Escape, in honor of Harry Houdini and his friend, the not-so-great escape. I'll tell you, though, when we used to do this from a moving trolley, last night the trolley ever ran, night before Halloween, about 7 years ago. I was the guide. It was a warm night like this. So warm, in fact, we had company as we passed the front. The lady picks up her microphone, and there they go now. They were the 2 gentlemen who were running alongside the trolley accompanying us, waving at the audience, dressed similar to Harry and his friend. No, not socks and underwear, big baby diapers. They disappear into the night and fog of the night before Halloween, and I say, ladies and gentlemen, there were stories about this town I told you could never make up. Thank you very much. I've just had my case proven. Welcome to Salem. Happy Halloween. On very cold and rainy nights, there are times when I very much do miss that trolley. You're amazed at actually how famous this building truly is. Now, there's a number of different reasons for its fame. Sorry, wetting the whistle. Some of them are actually literary reasons. One of them, this building is called the Grimshaw House, from a short story written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, published after his death, called The Tales of Dr. Grimshaw. This is the actual building he references in his story. The Tales of Dr. Grimshaw is said to be one of those cautionary tales. Be careful of what you ask for in life. Y'all might get it. Now, historically, the house's other name is the Peabody House. Sophia Peabody, Hawthorne's wife-to-be, and her sisters live in this house. One of the younger sisters will go on to marry a gentleman by the name of Horace Mann and then start the first kindergarten in America in the 1800s. Hawthorne himself famously claimed to see a ghost here, entering, somewhat appropriately, from the cemetery side wall, walking across the room in front of him, and then disappearing into a fireplace. Oh, by the way, for the record, that's the oldest cemetery in Salem right there. Now, another author writes about this house. This year actually celebrates the 125-year anniversary of this author's birth. He is a gentleman by the name of Howard Phillips Lovecraft.
Yes.
H.P. Lovecraft writes the short story, The Unnameable, based upon this house, describing a cold October day, icy winds blowing past the Gothic crypts, that's what those big blocky square things are, towards the desolate old house. Much of the inspiration for Lovecraft's haunted city of Arkham, not to be confused with the Batman city of Arkham, is actually Salem and its environs. There really was a quote-unquote Arkham Asylum. It was the Danvers State Mental Hospital. And this place had a couple of double whammies to boot, because it was built on the site where the hanging judge of the witch trials, John Hathorne, had his mansion. Apparently somebody deemed it appropriate to pile all that bad karma up in one space where we could keep our eyes on it. And so creepy was this place that they also, after it closed, filmed a horror movie there in the 90s called Session 9. Now, during the Great Fire of 1914, the industrial waterfront of Salem is being devastated. This building was actually damaged. It was rebuilt to this configuration, which actually beggars the question, if it's this bloody creepy now, what did it look like when Lovecraft saw it? I'm just saying. Now, the building is in fact currently unoccupied. There are lights on. Not as many as there were a couple of nights ago. The last gentleman, very, very elderly man in his 90s who lived here, we believe has passed away. His bedroom was in the second floor up there, and there is still the stair climber attached to the stairs. Believe it or not, this is not a tenement. This is all one big house. We have heard, though, that somebody did have an intention for this place. It has been placed on the market several times, usually very expensively. They wanted to turn it into a bed and breakfast. Yeah, I know. Think about it. Well, it's a quiet neighborhood.
Sure.
They're not dying to get in here anymore.
No.
Yeah, I went there.
Be quiet.
Not at Halloween, it won't. The only place I know of that puts floodlights up in the cemeteries. Now, somebody did make a very valid point, though, that only in two cities does this make a lot of sense. One of them being Salem, the other one, a famous city of hauntings and magic. I heard somebody whispering something.
Gettysburg.
Gettysburg is a good place for hauntings. Not so sure about the magic. But this is a little further south.
New Orleans.
Bingo! I heard a lot of New Orleans. You're on the money. Yeah, think about it. Although some young lad last year was very, very amusing and said Disney.
It's a lot of magic there.
Yeah. I mean, and it'll haunt you to this day. Well, it'll haunt your pocketbook anyways. Hey now. And the weird things don't happen in the past. Oh no. This time last year we came up the hill and there was a TV truck there doing a location shot. Well, apparently this young man had decided to get in touch with his past. They arrested this gentleman in the cemetery during the day trying to dig up a grave in broad daylight in front of about 45 different witnesses. When he was arraigned, his lawyer claimed that, oh yes, the young man in fact found the hole like that and was trying to fill it in. Stick with that story. It might get you somewhere, other than the 90 days of psychiatric evaluation that he in fact did get.
But he didn't get in jail.
I still don't know how that turned out yet. I think they kind of hoped that everybody would forget it.
Yes.
I didn't do it tonight, but I felt it was a safe night. Usually I'll tap on the wall with my cane. The reason why is one night I came here, told all the ghost stories. Somebody came up to me after the story and said, by the way, I don't know if you were aware, but while you were leaning against that wall, there's a skunk sitting back there. He never twitched, which to me tells me that he likes a good ghost story. That's my story and I'm sticking to it.
I was going to say you didn't stink that night.
No. That was a good one. I like it. See, this is what I like when the people work with you. Now, this is the Pickman House. This is one of those places that you really can't make up. Built in the 1650s, said to be marked by tragedy through most of its existence, at least while it was occupied. Young girl claimed by illness early on in its history. The thing that sets the tragedy off is the house should have been quarantined when the girl got ill. The family was hearing nothing of it. No, they quarantined the poor daughter in the attic. Fed her through a trap door. Of course, medical science being what it was in those days, this doesn't have a happy ending. The family was heartbroken, they say, and moved away in great haste. I don't think it was heartbreak that drove them out of here. Because once the place was empty, it was never quiet again. Strange noises of all hours, day or night, strange lights at night. One of the sheriff's men, investigating what he saw to be a light floating in the window, gets a broken arm for his troubles. Oh, the light was floating. They hadn't finished the floor in that corner of the house yet. He fell through and broke his arm. Another case here is a murder of a young woman. It was a husband and wife that lived here. A craftsman was the husband. He's going to have a workshop. He's going to make goods for the family. add income to themselves. And this is an honorable thing, but Salem is full of wonderful ideas on the surface that go south pretty much soon afterwards. Primarily because he put the workshop in the attic. Tools were moving around, things were disappearing, then he starts to hear voices. The voices led to madness and then to murder. They say he murdered his young wife with a kettle of boiling wax from the workshop, then took his own life by hanging. Once again, we have an empty house that is not quiet. The hauntings begin to accelerate in pitch with every disaster that happens, till finally the neighbors are being driven away. Spooked away, literally. Now comes the museum. They take possession of this beautiful example of colonial architecture. What's their brilliant idea? We're gonna hold a tour. Keep them coming, boys. The person who gets the receiving end of this one is the caretaker. He was hired to lead tourists through the daylight. At night, he's supposed to maintain the place. That was the plan, except he was frightened out of here the first night he ever worked here. He says the noises he heard after sunset were so horrifying, there was not enough money in the world to make him come back here after dark again. And he only ever worked here in daylight again. Then somebody came to their senses, closed the building to the public. It's a research wing for the museum. But all sorts of things happen here. Sometimes pictures don't always work. Cameras don't always work. Sometimes you can't get them to focus on the building. Sometimes they won't snap the picture, and sometimes they just go bloody dead. There's a lot of strange energy here. People have claimed on at least one tour to have seen a face in the third floor window. Sometimes you get pictures of faces in this window. Just curious. 9 times out of 10 they begin explained as reflections. The 10th one, not so much. And ghost radar. Yeah, they got an app for that. And usually on several occasions someone has trotted one out and been rewarded with anywhere from 1 to goodness knows how many pings from inside the house. Which is why they say the Pickman House is one of the most haunted places here in Salem. Now we're going to duck into the memorial quick because I'm going to show you where the hanging judge of the witch trials, John Hathorne, is buried.
Can I ask a question?
Hopefully I have an answer for you.
Has any paranormal investigators been to this house?
We don't think so. The problem is the museum takes a dim view on the more spectacular history of Salem.
So they wouldn't want to clear the house by.
No, they would.
They'd rather just leave it go and.
They'd probably.
Stay silent.
They just. Yeah. Their biggest. The 3 biggest pet peeves in Salem are ghost tours, witch shops, and haunted houses, in no particular order. Thank you. They were a much more colorful place before they built the new wing. Yeah. In fact, I'll explain some of that color very shortly. As I said, this is the Witch Trial Memorial, dedicated on the 300-year anniversary of the trials, rededicated in 2012, which was the 320-year anniversary. There are 20 benches around the walls here, dedicated to the main victims of the trials. There were actually a couple of different ideas for a memorial. One was, in fact, a traditional statue. We were talking about the Bewitched statue. There was actually a traditional witch memorial statue. I actually contributed to having it originally started up, I want to say back in the 80s. They did finally cast the statue. I believe it's inside the Wax Museum there. The other one they have a model of at the Visitor Center. One look at it tells you why they didn't choose it. There's a gallows. Now, there are 19 benches for the men and women accused. Yes, men can be charged with witches. In fact, that particular bench, George Burroughs, was a minister in those days. They actually went up as far as Wells, Maine, which in those days was part of Massachusetts colony, and dragged him down here to convict him. One of the more colorful instances, they claimed that a witch could not recite the Lord's Prayer. The devil would make him trip up. On the gallows ladder, George Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. Perfect grammar, perfect diction. Yes, they hanged him anyways. And of course, we have the bench for Giles Corey. Here's one of those cases. His is under the light. His is the largest and heaviest bench in them all. Just the thing for the man pressed under heavy stones. Now, the reason why the memorial is sited here, and the reason why it opens up to see the cemetery at the end, people from the witch trials are buried here. Specifically, the white stone that's out there, the square one, that is the burial site of one Justice John Hathorne of the Court of Oya and Termina to see and determine the witch trial court. This is not a nice man. This is the man they call a hanging judge. His biggest complaint was they wouldn't let him hang witches fast enough. Oh, and he didn't stop there. After the trials, there was a lot of soul searching, a lot of recriminations, a lot of finger pointing. They wanted to see the villains of the piece pay. None of the girls were ever held very accountable, but the one person they wanted was Sheriff Corwin, because he'd been pocketing the proceeds of torturing and murdering, basically, his neighbors throughout the entirety of 1692. They could not prosecute him because the man protecting him, John Hathorne, is one of his uncles. This is how he was getting away with murder, literally. Now, Hathorne's got backup. He's got the best backup politics can buy. The man backing up Hathorne, the Lieutenant Governor and Chief Justice of Massachusetts Bay Colony, William Stoughton. And his whole purpose in being here during 1692? He was supposed to keep the Puritans from getting out of control with that witch trial business. Yeah, you see how that worked out. He was egging them on. He was willing to hang people on the basis of spectral evidence alone, never mind the trial. So the two of them used their political power to make sure that Corwin could never be held accountable. Well, in this they succeeded. Pity they couldn't do nothing about that curse business. Now this is also the great-great-grandfather of Nathaniel Hawthorne. Notice the difference, Hathorne and Hawthorne, not just tomatoes, tomatoes. Hawthorne made a very impassioned plea to the courts to change his name because he said this man left a black mark on his reputation. In fact, he said this man left a black mark wherever he went. If you dug up the body, he would probably have stained the ground black. The courts allowed him to change the name. Now further back, about 100 yards, there's a very small headstone. Embarrassingly, a week ago, I couldn't find it. I swear I think they moved that bloody thing. But it's the burial stone for Mary Corey, Giles' second wife, the one with the problem with the stairs. They call the ghost that they say that she is the Lady in Black. They say she's looking for Giles. And in fact, the place I usually tell the story from is where Giles, during the daytime anyways, when we are allowed in the cemetery, is where Giles is supposed to be buried. He is not here, nor are any of the victims of the witch trials. They were deemed unworthy of Christian burial by the witch trial court. The truly fortunate were taken home to their family farms, such as Rebecca Nurse, who was on her farm, bless you, in Danvers, which was once Salem Village. Giles and his last wife, Martha, are supposed to be somewhere near the edge of their mill pond in what was once Salem Farms, now the town of West Peabody. The irony is, the only one legally able to be buried here of all those victims was Giles Corey. Remember the circumstances of his death. He was not tried and convicted. That was what that unfortunate torture was about. Although, in their infinite wisdom, some of the witch trial court deemed his death by torture, no, I'm not making this up, suicide. Well, he asked for more weight. I guess that was their reasoning. Now, this is what the oldest cemetery in Salem. There is said to be a lot of paranormal activity, mostly involving the back corner. Some of it is said to have spilled out, sometimes to the Wax Museum, sometimes to the Murphy's Tavern. There's also said to be a lot of magical energy here. And according to some of them, the tree in the back corner, just behind this big one here, is said to be one of the sources of magical energy in Salem. One of the names I've heard given for it is the Mother Tree. The reason why they claim this tree is supposed to be older than Salem, well over 300 years. At times they say you would find offering bags tossed up into the branches during the ceremonies at, say, May Eve, summer solstice. And according to a couple of my friends who are Salem witches, they actually thanked me one night because they said, you are probably the only guide we've ever heard who actually was taught the right part of this story. So apparently I had the right teachers. But the other tree we like to have a little fun with is directly behind me, silhouetted against the gas station. This one isn't as fancy as the Mother Tree. This is the Lightning Tree. As you might have guessed, this tree and its environs takes a lot of lightning strikes. In fact, the back part of the tree, which you can't see from here, isn't there. Blown to splinters by lightning strikes. Why does this tree attract such unwanted attention from the gods? Well, it's the headstone at the foot of the tree, belonging to a young man by the name of Caleb Pickman. Yes, there's a good possibility that he was related to the people in that house, and if so, his luck was running true to form, because he was struck by lightning on his sailing ship in the harbor. His headstone is on the foot of the tree, and it says, as it faces the tree, killed by lightning. And every 29 years, the tree is said to take another hit. That's about the same amount of time that Caleb was alive. So you can understand why they tucked him in a corner by himself. He's a bloody menace even in the afterlife. Unless the sky is very clear and very bright, I tend to avoid that corner because on at least 2 separate occasions I have told this story from here, and we have been rewarded with the rumble of thunder from the back of the cemetery. Yes, I do attract that kind of luck. So we're going to head back to the main shop. Oh, I will tell you for the record that on several occasions I see people taking pictures. Hathorn Stone has turned up with strange things around it. So if you've taken pictures, that's a good one to get. At least one lady ran after me after the tour was over one night to show me the picture of the mist that she got around the stone. So we're going to go back to the store to talk about a famous haunting, a famous murder, and the most famous pirate in history, and his connection to Salem. A 6-foot demon was standing behind him with a sword. Till he turned around. Don't worry, he wasn't a little kid. I wouldn't do that to a little child. He was about 14. He might live to be 15. He was rather surprised. He was just like, "Arr." His mother was in hysterics, and my attitude was, God, I love my job. I didn't even have to make a noise. He just stood there. Very, very quietly. Okay, back at the beginning. Hang the lantern in the window, Ma. We might not be home till dark. Okay, we'll just leave that there. It's too new, I don't want to break it. Now, we're at the site of our last stop. The Gardner Pingree House. Also known as the Clue House. Now, the Parker brothers, as we heard earlier, they're pretty good taking advantage of other people's games. Monopoly they bought from that gentleman down near Philadelphia. Risk was actually originally from France. The Ouija board, I'm not sure I want to know. Clue was a British game called Cluedo. There was a cultural exchange, if you will. They got to manufacture Monopoly, which was our top parlor game. We got Cluedo. There was much rejoicing. Yay. Thank you. We shortened Cluedo to Clue, and the names were changed a little bit. The reason why the Parkers were inspired was the murder that takes place here in 1830. We just passed the 185-year anniversary of the death of a Captain Joseph White in that very bedroom on the 2nd floor. A little bit about White. He was a wealthy merchant and ship owner. Amount of good things to say about White. Because Captain Joseph White was in fact never mind.
Girls go around the outside.
Captain Joseph White was a slave trader. And I'm thinking of somebody he should have sold into slavery right now. No. Yeah, slavery had been outlawed in Massachusetts in the late 1780s, as had been the carrying of human cargo through the port of Salem. It is a pretty much open but dirty secret that many of the most famous merchant families did carry slaves. White was different in the fact that he boasted of it. He also treats his family horribly. His last living relative, his grandniece Mary Beckford, was exiled, disowned, penniless, because she married one of his ship captains, a man by the name of Joseph Knapp, and for good measure he fires Knapp. April 6, 1830, the captain's manservant goes upstairs to the bedroom to rouse the captain. He didn't wake at his usual time. He will not rise again. He's been clubbed over the head with a blunt object, then stabbed repeatedly through the chest with so much violence that several of his bones were shattered. There is no motive for this crime. Though he was far from the angel that the newspapers eulogized him as, nobody could come up with a reason for such sheer brutality. It wasn't robbery. At the foot of the captain's bed, a large iron-bound sea chest filled with gold coin. Also the captain's personal papers. The chest was unlocked and apparently, as far as anybody could tell, untouched. They formed the Committee of Vigilance to investigate this crime. It's about a dozen people who were sworn to secrecy and who were paid a lot of money, $1,000 per person, which in those days is a great sum. They're turned loose to investigate. They begin to bring in suspects. Two of them are brothers named Knapp. They also arrest two of their friends from across the harbor in Marblehead. But the two important people they grab are brothers Richard and George Crowninshield. The Crowninshields are Salem's most wealthy and politically influential merchant family. They're also the family that brings in the drunken elephant. Richard and George are gangsters. Richard is likened to being a kind of criminal like, pretty much like Whitey Bulger. He's not afraid to get his hands bloody. Criminal enterprise along the waterfront, smuggling. He knows where the hidden tunnels around here are. Gambling halls, brothels. He is in fact the most hated and despised man in all of Salem. Women, however, adore the man. He's tall and handsome. He treats them like royalty. He spends lavishly. The only human being it said that he actually cares for, his younger brother George, who he protects from punishments to the exclusion of all else. They're all locked in the Salem jail. The grand jury comes in. 5 minutes later, the grand jury goes home. There's no evidence. There are no witnesses. The two friends of the Knapps were released. It should have ended there. But a lot of people wanted to see Richard hanged for this crime. Not the least of which because the political scandal, the scandal alone could break the family's hold on politics, which in those days was pretty much ironclad. Now, if you look hard enough for something to connect somebody to something in a wrong way, it tends to turn up, whether it's really there or not. That could be the case with Richard. Then again, the evidence could have been legit. But either way, Richard knows the jig is up. He knows that his life is probably going to end soon. He's going to protect George this last time. He studied the law. By the laws of the day, if Richard cannot be tried and convicted as the principal in first-degree murder, George can't be prosecuted as one of its accomplices. To take himself out of the picture, he will hang himself from the bars of his cell in Old Salem jail, leaving a poem to George and a letter that accepts responsibility for the crime, not to say a confession, which will stop the wheels of justice for 5 seconds. They want somebody so bad they bring in a ringer. The man they bring in is Daniel Webster, who at this point in his career was a very famous defense attorney. He goes on to become one of our greatest statesmen. Why would you bring in a defense attorney to prosecute? Because he's the best at what he does, and he likes big showy crimes. And if they didn't hire him, pretty much sure the Crowninshields would have. Now he's also a bit of a drinker and a gambler. They pay off all his debts. They give him $1,000. It seems to be the going rate. He's so good at what he does, he manages, without witnesses or evidence, to convict both Knapp brothers of first-degree murder. They'll be hanged at Old Salem jail. And the summation of his trials is so methodical and precise and chilling, they say, that a young reporter uses what he hears as the inspiration for the most famous horror story in the world, The Telltale Heart. The young reporter, a young Edgar Allan Poe. He and Webster both covered, Hawthorne both covered this case for the press. Something happened because they never got along again. Now, Webster would try to do the same thing to George Crowninshield. Oh no, he won't. Richard may have been the most hated person in town. Everybody came to George's defense, from the politicians, to the merchants, to the guy in the corner, to the two young ladies who worked at one of the night locations of the Crowninshields, all of whom who claimed that George was not the murderer, in some cases were rather occupied that night, if you will. That was their stories, they stuck to them, and they acquitted George of murder. He returns to his home and dies of old age. Now come the ghosts. They require a trigger. Here's another one of those ideas that sounded really good on the surface, but was not really thought through. The trigger is the house to the right of the Gardner Pingree house. Its original home was behind the hotel. They were going to destroy it to build a parking lot. But this is the start of the preservation craze. It's a famous house. So we'll move it. they move it to sit next door to the Gardner Pingree house. Why does this trigger the ghosts? The Crown and Shield house, where George died. Yeah, they should have thought this one through better. Those ghosts that were quiet up till now, they make up for vengeance, for lost time with a vengeance. Pun intended. One ghost chases the other through both properties with so much force that when they get going, they're supposed to knock furniture aside, knock things off the mantels and shelves, knock portraits off the walls, and for good measure, there's stories of heart attacks after watching the ghosts. Now from the portraits, well, we figured out who they are. It's said that one of them is Captain Joseph White. He's doing the chasing. Who's he chasing? It's not Richard. It's not the Knaps. They say he's got George Crowninshield in his sights. Did George do it? Remember, Richard's letter only accepted responsibility for the crime. Now, Richard may have known what his brother did. Then again, the captain may be chasing the only Crowninshield he can in fact find. Either way, he hunts him to this day. And the motive for this crime? The Knapp brothers never forgave what Captain White did to their father. So they cooked up supposedly a scheme with the Crowninshields. Captain White dies without his will. That money goes all to his last blood relative, their new aunt, Mary Beckford. So 3 days before the murder, one of the Knapp brothers is at a dinner party in the house, Joseph Jr., and he goes upstairs when nobody is looking to the captain's bedroom. From the sea chest, he nicks the will. Perfect plan. It already failed. 5 days before the murder, the captain felt so unwell that he decided to make sure all his affairs were in order. So he took a little trip to his lawyer's office downtown, and in front of witnesses, he drafted a new will. When Joe Jr. was upstairs with his hand in the cookie jar, he should have helped himself to the gold, because the captain left the will with the lawyer. He stole the wrong paper. It was a gamble that was big, and unfortunately in the end they paid the ultimate price. And ladies and gentlemen, with that our last story, I bid you all thank you for accompanying me on the Salem night tour. And there was in fact much rejoicing. Yay! Thank you guys very, very much. And oh yes, the Crowninshield house was said to be the inspiration for the Lovecraft story, The Thing Upon the Stairs. One last little zinger there. So thank you guys very much. Please remember us on TripAdvisor. With that...